So let's talk about how we move forward in these 5 where we want to increase these behaviors. Just as a reminder, we keep using the word more in this space. It's not that people who are compassionate are using them all the time. And it's not that people who are less compassionate leaders are never using this. It's really calibrating the degree. One of the things about empathy that I mentioned is that empathy is tricky because most people feel empathy. It's built into our brains to care for other people, to have a caring response. The thing with leadership is, does your empathy extend into the leadership space, and can people see it? So teaching people what an empathetic behavior is, as distinguishing from a felt sense of empathy, is where the key in coaching is. Strategic is interesting in this space because strategic says, at a general level, I pause to think ahead. I pause to understand implications. So, in the compassionate leadership space, it is pausing to understand, who should I include? What else might people be experiencing? How do we assess the implications on people of moving one way or the other? And again, not just doing it in your head. A compassionate leader shows their strategic thinking and how their thinking is aligned with how I'm considering the implications on others. Consensual is stopping often and early to ask for input. So, again, having those questions in the back pocket. What are your thoughts about this? What are your ideas? Where do you see the risks? And do it early enough so that it matters in the way forward and people feel genuinely included. Communication is critical. And what's interesting about this one is, and I saw in one of the questions, it's very noisy right now in the world, right? It's noisy in the media, it's noisy in organizational life. Our inner worlds are very noisy right now. And so the compassionate leader makes time to make sure that their messaging is clear, that it's understood. And often that means repeating the message, which can at one level be so frustrating. But it's sort of a pay me now or pay me later thing. Either at the front end, we're very clear and we are sure that that message has embedded in the other, or we are playing catch up for the rest of the way through the implementation or the process. And finally, cooperation is letting people know when and where you are available to be of assistance, to be helpful, and when and where you're willing to compromise. The compassionate leader is not always available to cooperate, is not always willing to compromise. The compassionate leader makes clarity or is clear around when they can do this work, right? So the more we have clarity in this space around helpfulness, around messaging, around asking for input, around demonstrating empathy, around demonstrating where you're being strategic, it creates that more space for that compassionate leadership. In that do more space, there's 2 themes. The first theme is, I'm taking a little bit of time. I am understanding that if I take time now, flowing forward will be easier. And I'm putting others first, not all the time, but making space for a little bit more of putting others first. Let's look at the dial down behaviors. Let's look at where it's not that we're not doing them. We're just being careful of the ratio of where they show up, right? So the first is dominant. That's probably feels obvious. Being mindful of how often you're debating, being forceful, being very assertive. One of the things that's helpful to show our coachees is when you are in a more powerful position, um, defined by your role. I'm X person's manager. Automatically, their brain is geared to see you as more assertive, more forceful, because in their minds, you have more power. So the calibration of dominant has to include how the power that exists in the role that you have. Self is how often you go off on your own, thinking, deciding, working independently, isolating yourself in the work. This is a tricky one because a lot of leaders have independent and individual contributor responsibilities. A lot of leaders in and of themselves can feel overwhelmed. And so the chance to think by themselves, to work by themselves can feel very compelling, to close themselves off so they can feel like they can get something done. So it's not that we don't want to give leaders independent, more isolated space. It's just the balance of how often you're in isolation versus in connection with others. We've talked about the feedback. The issue here is the thoughtfulness in the feedback, and what happens if it's overused. It can be too blunt. It can happen without thoughtfulness or empathy. It can happen without enough communication in the front end to have sort of earned your right in the feedback space. So it is not that we want people, compassionate leaders are not low on feedback. They're just balancing feedback more effectively with the other behaviors. And finally, production. Remember, what we said is actually compassionate leaders are seen as higher on ability to deliver results than low compassionate leaders. So it's not that the compassionate leaders are not focusing on goals. It's just that they're right sizing the frequency of use of how often they use the focus on production as the lever for delivering results, right? So it's a balance on this is our goal, but how do I get us engaged compassionately towards the goal versus not using production as the hammer to drive the goal. Also, a theme in this doing less space. Um, we are dialing down that forceful push, that assertive pushing for production, pushing in the dominance, pushing in the bluntness of our feedback. So we're just dialing down that forceful push, and we're dialing back the me first, which I think, as an aside, I'll put in a plug, and I think all of us as coaches believe in this. There's a space for how does the leader care for themselves at a fundamental level so that when they come into that leadership space, they have energy for others. And so that is, what is their approach to wellness? What is their approach to caring for self? How do they keep themselves grounded and centered in the leadership space? Where is their peer group so that they can let off some steam in the peer group so that they can come into this compassionate leadership space and have enough energy to make space for others? So just a reminder, when we're talking about behavior change at MRG, we're seeing behavior as a dial much more than a light switch. It's not turn this behavior on or turn that behavior off. It is really that finesse of how to understand when you need to use a little bit more of a behavior and when you need to modify down a little bit of behavior. It's subtle work, but the subtle doesn't mean easy, which is why coaching is so critical when we're looking at these important behavior changes.